Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us to hear the introductory lecture for Italian style fashion since 1945. I'm Brian Fariso, the director of the museum, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Sonnet Stanfill here from the V&A. But before I introduce Sonnet, I'd like to make a few announcements, recognize a few people. And first on that list is this lecture actually is being supported by the John E. Buchanan Memorial Fund. And John, as many of you know, was my predecessor here and beautifully served this institution and community for over 10 years. And there was a fund set up to host an annual lecture in his memory. So we're very pleased to allocate those funds towards this lecture. I'm sure John would approve. Before I introduce Sonnet again, I want to recognize a few sponsors. And the top of that list, and you saw these names going as you sat, and I wanted to draw your attention to the one at the top, and that's Nordstrom. Nordstrom is the lead sponsor of this project. Nordstrom gave us one of the largest corporate gifts in our recent 10 years. It is a fabulous gift. They understood the importance of this show immediately. It aligns with their objectives, but they are also extremely community-minded, and I want to give a big round of applause to Nordstrom. That being said, there had to be a lot more fundraising for this project. It's an ambitious project for this institution, and there are several people I need to call out. First on that list is Joanne Lilly, a past trustee of the museum, life trustee Laura Meyer, as well as a number of other key trustees and donors of this institution, and I want to just mention a few: Lisa Brooke, Rana and Eric Hoffman, Fred and Gail Jubitz, Cindy and Ed Miletus, the Mark family in honor of Mary Mark, Nancy McGraw, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, Andre Stevens, and Helen Joe and Bill Witzel. Let's give them a round of applause for their support. The background on this exhibition, I wanted to make a few points to that regard. Started several years ago. In 2009, this museum, we decided to expand our curatorial vision, expand our curatorial footprint, and think more broadly about what the museum should be doing. And that started with China Design Now, where we also collaborated with the V&A in 2009. We proceeded to present an exhibition on the allure of the automobile, and I think many of you remember that, in 2011. And then Cyclopedia in 2013. So the question becomes, what do you do to follow up those exhibitions? And it's important, I think, to have a fashion show. Fashion is very much part of our life, but it also is very much part of the history of art. And through fashion, I think we can understand art and cultures in a deep and meaningful way. To that regard, I think this show in particular has a very strong thesis. It has an excellent story, and it is a window into a time and a place, not only a culture, but also the great designers and the craftspeople of Italy. That being said, I would also say that it makes perfect sense for our institution to do that. Many people have asked me, why made in Italy? Why fashion? Why Italian style? Why Italian fashion in Portland? Well, I will tell you why. And the reason is, as many of you know, we are a city of makers. The city believes deeply in creating high levels of design, but also craftsmanship. The city is committed to that, and we think about the economy here, but also the artisans. In everything we do, we make great food, we make great wine, we make great beer. We also make beautiful products and clothes. So this makes a lot of sense, and I think if we reflect on other countries who do this, Italy is at the forefront and really set the tone for that commitment to making great objects. Also, I would like to highlight this exhibition in particular gives us a very good opportunity to have a range of programs. And I want to mention several of them because it is just beginning with today. On Sunday, March 1st, Jennifer Jacobs from MIT Research Lab will talk about the intersection of high tech and fashion. I'm sure it will be a fascinating talk. On Saturday, March 7th, Third Angle Music will present recent Italian music. We've always done very well partnering with Third Angle, an important organization here in our city, and it's wonderful to welcome them back in celebration of this show. And then Sunday, March 8th, we welcome author and former Oregonian film critic Sean Levy, where he will talk about the real Dolce Vita. He's writing an important book, and Sean is extremely knowledgeable, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that lecture. From March 6th to the 22nd, our Northwest Film Center is presenting a series of films, including Roman Holiday, and I know it's featured in the exhibition, but we will have a number of the great films which actually influenced a great deal of the content in this exhibition. So that will run throughout March, the 6th to the 22nd. Also, I would like to mention Meg Lukens-Noonan, who's author of the acclaimed book, The Coat Route, Craft, Luxury, and Obsession. This will be an important lecture to check out or to follow the provenance of this important coat that was created. And then Sunday, April 19th, Italian jewelry since 1945 will be given by David Margolis, an important jeweler here in town, and David will be speaking about that history. And then finally, March 26th, which is a Thursday, and April 2nd, which is also a Thursday, we'll be having a conversation with Eden Dawn, who is the Portland Monthly fashion editor, and Marjorie Skinner, who is also from the Portland Mercury. I would also like to acknowledge one other person who has been with this institution and has committed a number of resources, not only to many of our projects, but also to this exhibition in particular, and that is Nanny Warren. And I know Nanny is here with us this evening, or this afternoon. Nanny, thank you for your support of the show and also your foundation support of it. We are very, very grateful. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sonnet Stanfill. Sonnet is the curator of 20th century and contemporary fashion at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She has worked there since 1999. Her exhibitions include Ossie Clark in 2003, New York Fashion Now in 2007, and co-curation of ball gowns, British glamour since 1950 in 2012. She's published extensively and lectured widely. She holds an MA in the history of dress from the Courtauld Institute in London and a BA in art history from Smith College. It gives me great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Sonnet Stanfill.
Brian, thank you very much for that warm introduction. Thank you all for such a warm reception. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in Portland, and I think I want to move here, but I think everyone does. So I've been absolutely won over by the hospitality of the Portland Art Museum staff, their professionalism, and I've been deeply impressed by how beautifully they've managed to install an exhibition that started in London. And so that is why I'm here to speak to you today. And what I wanted to do is not just tell you about what you're going to see in the show, because you can do that on your own, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes peek into what the process of curating a show like this is all about. And of course, along the way, we're going to explore the themes and some of the objects that you'll encounter when you go. But what I hope that you'll take away is a group of stories and anecdotes and some background information that you can share with your friends so that you can spread the word about, what really is the behind the scenes about putting a show like this together. And I think, as Brian mentioned in his introduction, this show does make so much sense for Portland because some of the bigger themes of the exhibition really connect to craftsmanship, to artisanal quality, to incredibly beautiful textiles and raw materials, leather goods, and that's very present in the objects that you'll see within the show. The first slide that you're looking at is one of the posters for the exhibition here, and it features a 1950s couture gown by Simonetta, but it also has some logos, and I wanted to also echo my thanks to the sponsors, both individuals, foundations, and corporate sponsors who've made this exhibition possible here. Well do I know the significance of those efforts and those contributions, so thank you very much. So we're going to dive in. And the title of the exhibition, Italian Style Fashion Since 1945, indicates that we start with the close of the Second World War. And on the screen, you see here an image of the streets of Florence, taken in 1945. And looking at this image, I think it's really hard to imagine that in just a few years, Italy will become one of the epicenters of European fashion and a tastemaker. But that is, in fact, what happens, and we have some really exciting things to discover over the next hour together. One of the things that I started with when I curated this show was the V&A's own fashion collection. As Brian mentioned, I've been at the V&A for 15 years, and yes, it's a long way from Anchorage, Alaska, which is where I'm born and raised. But I will say that the V&A's collection, from the very first day that I started, I felt so privileged to be working there. It's one of the world's best in terms of fashion and textiles, and it really started as the foundation for this project. It took me about 6 months to sift through what the V&A has so that I could then decide what I needed to find elsewhere. And so that was the real bulk of my time over the 2.5 years it took to curate the show, was traveling back and forth to Italy. Poor me. Rome, Florence, Milan, Parma, really tough duty. But thanks to the generosity of Italian archives, Italian fashion designers, individual collectors, Italian museums, I was able to fill the gaps of this exhibition that were missing in the V&A's own collection. The photograph that you're looking at also comes from an archive. There's quite a bit of photography and film in the show, and increasingly fashion curators who are working on exhibitions need to rely on other types of materials in order to enliven static garments that are meant to be seen moving on the body in motion. And so there is quite a bit of photography and film in the show. This photograph comes from an archive called Locchi, L-O-C-C-H-I, that is located in Florence, one of these amazing resources in Italy that no one knows about. But they were a photo studio based in Tuscany, based in Florence for the last 150 years, that chronicled Italian life on the streets of Tuscany. They have photographs you wouldn't believe of everyday things like the Italian railway station being built in Florence, of the fashion shows I'm about to describe to you. And thanks to resources like this, it helped me to tell the story. And so our story begins at the end of the war. And of course, Italy, like much of the rest of Europe, was devastated both physically and economically, and took quite a long time to rebuild. But thanks to the Marshall Plan and a lot of investment, particularly in the textile industry, Italy was able to retool quite quickly. It's a far cry from what was going on during the war, because the Italian government, the fascist regime, was actually trying to regulate fashion production by awarding something called the Marca di Garanzia that you see here as a kind of reward to obedient producers who were making fashion according to the strict regulations of wartime shortages. This mark of guarantee, it's kind of an unassuming little label, but it's very exciting because very few survive, partly because very few were awarded. The Italian system was, not surprisingly, not very efficient. And so to find a garment that has a mark of guarantee inside as evidence of this fascist attempt to control fashion is incredibly exciting. One of the first things that you'll see when you go upstairs are 2 day dresses from the wartime, and one of them has this mark of guarantee inside, and you'll see a photograph of it, of this little label. We've photographed it and put it next to the garment so you can see it, what it looks like. So when I saw this, I borrowed this outfit from a collector in Rome, and it was a kind of jump up and down moment when I saw this mark. It was so exciting. I'd only seen photographs of it in books before. So again, looking at that sort of destroyed Florentine street and looking at a label like this, thinking about the difficulties of wartime fashions and provisions, it is hard to imagine what comes next, but it is pretty spectacular. So we're going to zoom right ahead to the 50s, where the story gets really glamorous. And so I'll just back up a moment. The title of this section in the exhibition is the Salah Bianca. And Salah Bianca in Italian means white hall. And it's a room that you see here in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, an old Medici palace that's across the Arno, just in front of the Boboli Gardens. And this room was the stage set where some of the first Italian fashion shows that were internationally attended happened. And before I get ahead of myself, I'm going to tell you about one man who made this possible. The gentleman on the far left is Giovanni Battista Giorgini. He was a buying agent before the war, meaning that he helped mainly North American department stores to import Italian handicrafts. So he had very strong, warm relationships with a lot of the big North American stores like Macy's and Bloomingdale's. So he had great connections. And he decided at the war's end that if France can produce someone like Christian Dior and host glamorous fashion shows, then Italy could do it too. So he decided to put on a show. And the very first show took place in Giorgini's house in Florence on Via dei Serragli, 1951, February. He pulled in all the favors he could. He wrote letters. He wrote telegrams. He put the pressure on his North American contacts to come to Florence and attend his first show. The first event took place, as I said, in his home. Probably only half a dozen buyers came. It was a small group, but deeply influential. The buyer from I. Magnin in San Francisco was there, and I know that Portland once had a Magnins when they were still in business. The buyer from Bloomingdale's was there. Also, a reporter from Women's Wear Daily, at that time the most influential fashion publication that existed. These small individuals went and spread the word, so that within just a few years, the shows transferred from Giorgini's living room to the Salah Bianca, and it had swelled to the hundreds. So Italian fashion became the new flavor of the month. People were clamoring to acquire these glamorous gowns. In this photograph, you see Giorgini standing with models. It was taken in 1956. It was actually, this photo was taken in England at Osterley House because Giorgini took Italian fashion on the road. He brought models to New York. He was a kind of an endless promoter and a real showman, impresario. So thanks to his efforts, Italian fashion it came across the American radar for the first time in the early 1950s. In this section, you'll see beautiful gowns, such as this Pucci, and it doesn't look like much on the table in the museum in Palazzo Pitti where I borrowed it from, but you can see it in the photograph on the model, and in the exhibition, it's an absolute fairy tale dream. All of this was possible, this research on Mr. Giorgini, thanks to this building. This unassuming, very drab building contains treasures. This is the State Archive in Florence, and I lived there for about a week and a half while I was going through Mr. Giorgini's papers. And this allowed me to really gain a greater understanding of what was going on in the dynamics between Italy and the United States at this time. And as an American who actually worked in one of the department stores that Giorgini invited to that first show, my first job out of college was a sales girl at I. Magnin, Union Square. And I found out that actually the North American government, there were telegrams and memos from US representatives to Mr. Giorgini that have been saved in the archive that illustrated that the Italian government actively promoted the American uptake of Italian fashion because they needed Italy's reputation to be rehabilitated after the war. They needed Italy as a valid trading partner, and so they wanted the American public to have a different perception of Italy other than its fascist past. So that is in part why the Americans were there early on, and because the American market was both vast and deeply influential, one purchase by I. Magnin of a Valentino collection could make or break that designer's career. So it is impossible to underestimate the importance of the American market in Italy's transformation from a kind of truly a peasant nation at the war's end to the powerhouse of fashion that it quickly became. That's not dissimilar to the dynamics that happened in other European countries, but I think in Italy it was much more dramatic. I know you can't see what's on this list, so I'm going to tell you. This is a framed document that is quite unassuming, but it's one of my favorite objects in the show. So if you're wanting to know what the curator's picks are, this is one of them. I'll shout out the others as I go along, but what this is a document that lists the American buyers that were invited to the show in 1955. And I'm proud to say, top of the list is I. Magnin, for those of you who can't see. But we also have B. Altman from New York, Marshall Field from Chicago, Morgans from Montreal, Jordan Marsh. We also have Filings from Boston and Macy's. So these are the powerhouse individuals that are the filters of taste for the North American market. These buyers are buying mainly couture because these department stores had couture salons within their premises. They filtered the best selection possible from each designer's collections, brought them back to their stores. The individuals could go and be fitted, and those gowns would be made in Italy and then sent to the department stores. Here are some photographs from the first show in Giorgini's house. The gentleman on the right is Mr. John Nixon, who was the buyer for Morgan's department store in Montreal. And the lovely lady next to him is Giorgini's daughter, Matilda. I think they had a little dalliance, but I'm not entirely sure. You tell me from their body language if you think I'm right. But as proof, perhaps, I saw on the invitation lists for year after year, he came back to many, many fashion shows in Florence. The little photographs are actually postage stamp size on the left, and those are photos from the first show in his living room. And you are some of the only people who are privileged enough to see these. They've never been shown outside of this exhibition. So most Italians have never seen these photos and don't know the story that these early shows were, our first show was in his house. So it's quite exciting to see this little window onto the past. This, there's a lot to say about this particular image. What's important, I think, for those of you in the audience that know about Emilio Pucci and his connection to Reed College, he, in fact, designed the ski uniforms for the Reed College ski team and had long-lasting and deep connections to the Portland area. He showed at the first Salah Bianca fashion show this outfit that you see. It doesn't look like Pucci. But I think, you know, with its Aztec print, it's not kind of what we think of as the kaleidoscopic, typical Pucci outfit. But you will, I think, recognize a connection in the very vibrant print and also the fact that it's beachwear. He started out with beach and ski. And in fact, the woman on the catwalk is wearing that very outfit. And we borrowed this from the Pucci archive in Florence. So it was so exciting when I was looking through Giorgini's papers in the archive to find this photograph of the very outfit that I wanted to show you in the exhibition. So to marry them up together is very exciting. You can just see John Nixon with his bow tie in the front row as proof that he's still, you know, coming to Florence. I just wanted to pause and say before I move on, Pucci is the only designer who showed at Giorgini's first event in his house in '51, whose house is still going today. So just to kind of file that away, it's something that doesn't come across in the exhibition, but all the others who showed, their names have been forgotten. So we're moving on to another part of the exhibition. It's a very little kind of section, really, that's talking about a very different kind of fashion. This is about the dressmaker. And it's important to remember that Italy was a country where the tradition of going to your local dressmaker and having clothes made for you, or your local tailor for that matter, lasted much longer than in many countries in the rest of Europe. Italy has long valued the handmade and the bespoke, made to measure, and the dressmaker may have been just a local firm, perhaps not very famous, perhaps no designer label, but they were still capable of creating the highest quality fashions. And that's what we'll show you here. This is a section of clothing worn by one woman, Mrs. Werner Abegg, and here you see her in her very jolly photograph. She wrote to the V&A in the 1970s saying, "I've now in Switzerland clothes made for me in my younger, slimmer days that have been considered by some to be rather exceptional, not only in New York, but when worn in Paris. Would the keeper of costumes care for them in his store, as I should like to present them to the Victoria and Albert?" So we did acquire them, a selection of evening gowns and day suits. And what's exciting about this group of garments, many things. One is they've never been shown before. In fact, when they were cataloged, the V&A originally cataloged them as Italian ? So were they Italian? Were they French? Who cares? They're anonymous. But when I went through the storeroom and found them, I did a bit of digging, and it turns out that they were made by a dressmaker in Turin, Maria Grimaldi. Bit of a shadowy figure. We don't know much about her. We know more about Mrs. Abegg, who was married to a wealthy textile manufacturer, so she knew her fabrics. But just look at the precision in the seaming on that coat, on the front seams as it goes in a kind of diamond pattern, really emphasizing the waist through its cut and construction. These were clothes who were made for a woman who knew about fabrics, who knew what suited her. She was in her 50s when she commissioned these things. Again, no designer label, but you can see here from the maker's mark that's stitched into some of the garments. It's a kind of little symbol for Maria Grimaldi. So those pieces that have this little floral spray, we know that they are by her hand. So exciting to be able to showcase this element that's particularly characteristic of Italian fashion, this going to your local dressmaker. Even people from the wealthiest sector of society had no trouble bypassing Paris and going just down the road. We also have a few of her accessories on show. We're moving now in a kind of loose chronology from the 1950s into the 60s. And the so-called Hollywood on the Tiber phenomenon. For those of you who know Italian film, you'll know that this is a moment in film history when Rome's Cinecittà became a kind of Hollywood outpost, and so many Italian films were shot on location in Rome. And I think it's more, there's a lot to say about the connection between fashion and film at this time. But it's not just that Hollywood's glitterati were frequenting Italian designers. It's that the paparazzi were relentlessly pursuing them and photographing them. And so all of a sudden, names that were known to just a few of the elite in the United States who were buying from Magnons and other stores, now were splashed across the pages of magazines and newspapers all across America, and these became household names. So here you have Audrey Hepburn shopping with Mr. Ferragamo in Florence, because of course they would take side trips from Rome to go sightseeing, to go shopping, to carry on their love affairs. So there was a lot of fodder for the kind of gossip press. And designers were very loyal, had very loyal customers. Ava Gardner was a very frequent customer and client of the Fontana sisters in Rome. This was a gown that she donated to the V&A, designed by the Sorelle Fontana. And we have a gown that was worn by Audrey Hepburn in the film War and Peace, that was made by a firm called Gattinoni, which is still in Rome today. I've been to their workrooms. A very delicate, lovely piece of couture that helped to promote the house, but also helped to shine a spotlight onto a whole generation of Italian designers. This is a very important moment, represented by this dress, another top pick of Curator's choice. This is a gown that was worn by Lee Radziwill, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy, to Truman Capote's Black and White Ball in 1966. It was designed by Mila Schon, who was a Milan-based couturier, who this collection was all handcrafted, of course. The sequin applique was all done by hand. I love the meandering pattern as it kind of snakes down the body. It's very, very elegant. And you can see from the photograph that by the time she hit the ballroom dance floor, she's checked her coat. And so you can see it's a sleeveless dress. She wore it with little silver ballet slippers, extremely chic. And it's in the V&A's collection. So what's exciting for me in telling the story about this dress is that here we have a woman who was known mainly, is known because she's still alive, mainly for her French couture wardrobe. And she's choosing an Italian to dress her for a ball. And it's not just a ball. Some people called it the party of the year, possibly the party of the decade, because it included some 500 of Capote's closest friends. And so we've come a long way from that exclusive group of buyers in Giorgini's house in 1951. 15 years after that event, one of the best dressed women in the world is choosing an Italian designer for the party of the decade. So this, for me, is a pivotal moment in our story when American women are choosing Italian first. And I love this photograph of the dance floor. You can just see the throngs. And there she is, Lee Radziwill with her arm bent, dancing in her dress. We've got, of course, other kind of prototypical examples of Italian style from this era, the palazzo pajamas worn by Jacqueline Kennedy to entertain informally in the White House. Beautiful silk shantung with embroidered collar, very, very typical for Italian style for this moment. And we have a lot of very quintessential Pucci. This is a close-up of a print on a garment that's in the show, plus a few pieces of beachwear. Pucci sold very, very well in the US, I think particularly in California on the West Coast because of the beach culture. His light fabrics, his easy cut and construction really filled a need for the American clientele. So we've got quite a few pieces of Pucci on display. We do have a Vespa. I had a Vespa moment when I was younger because I think there is this kind of connotation of free and easy living. That scene in Roman Holiday where Audrey Hepburn's scooting around the Colosseum is so quintessentially Italian. And that image really helped to promote Italian fashion. A lot of designers used the Vespa in their fashion adverts at this period. So it was really a conscious decision to link fashion with design. This Vespa came from a collector who found it in bits. It was imported into Britain in 1949. He found it in a pile of rubbish and basically put it together by hand and found the correct Pantone color to make it as authentic as possible. He does ride it. So I think after it finishes the US tour, we have to return it to him because he wants to take it on the ride to Brighton. So we also have one spectacular piece of jewelry in the show, and I'm delighted that we were able to borrow this brooch from a private collector because it tells the story of that Hollywood on the Tiber very neatly, because Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and their filming of Cleopatra in Rome, with their love affair kind of splashed across the pages and very scandalous at the time because they were both married, Richard Burton essentially wooed her with Bulgari jewels. Very clever man, very clever man. And he said that he once said that the only word that Elizabeth knows in Italian is Bulgari. So he was very adept at choosing pieces that she responded to, and this Diamante brooch is a very elegant choice. The photograph that you see of them together on the screen, you can just barely make out, but she is wearing it there. And so we're delighted to be able to include it because he bought it in Rome from the Bulgari main store on Via Condotti, which is just down the road from the Spanish Steps. So I note there are some men in the audience, and I thank you for coming. You might have been dragged here, but I'm delighted to see you because there is a lot to say about Italian menswear and, of course, Italian tailoring, which I think for being a curator based in London with Savile Row on our doorstep, it's really interesting to think about another tailoring tradition, which is often valued very fine quality, thinly spun wool, very lightweight wool, and also much more kind of dapper and daring details and than perhaps their British equivalents. So we have some examples of tailoring on show. I love this detail. This looks like it might be a woven herringbone, but it's actually printed. So, the Italians can be a bit flashy, which I love, but also capable, like this women's tailored piece by André Logue, who was a Frenchman living and designing in Rome, capable of some very elegant tailored women's wear as well. And these two pieces from the 1970s, which are in the V&A's collection, again, very dapper and, elegant choice of accessories and finishing details. These two gentlemen are the grandson and son of the founder of the tailoring firm Rubinacci, based in Naples. If you next go to Naples, I would recommend going there. Beautiful fit, beautiful construction and textiles. The Naples tradition is quite different. Italy has a lot of different regional tailoring differences, which in Naples tends to favor absolutely no lining or padding in the jacket. The Naples climate's very hot, and in order to kind of facilitate easy movement and comfort in the summer months, unlike the British suit jacket, which tends to be almost like armor, lots of padding and kind of, shall we say, gently correcting the defects of the wearer through, careful padding. The Naples equivalent is a very fluid, easy cut and construction without all of that inner lining. So you'll see some examples of these design houses on show in the exhibition. Now, tailoring is a good word to talk then as a kind of jumping off point to kind of transition to what happens next. Because up until now, we've been talking mainly, I've been showing you images and discussing mainly things that have been made by hand, bespoke suit made to measure, couture gown made for the individual wearer. All of these things took time. They took a lot of measuring had to happen. A toile would be made for a gown first. You come back for multiple fittings. So you had to be both wealthy and also have a lot of time to devote to building up your wardrobe, because it was a very time-consuming process to go through all of these fittings. But menswear and tailored menswear was one of the first categories of Italian fashion that started to be made in a factory and exported. And this is very important for our story because we're moving into a moment chronologically into the mid-1970s where there's a shift in taste and a shift in the way that people lived and dressed, moving away from bespoke and away from couture to ready-to-wear. The Italians were key to this transition because they were adept at making things in a factory to a very high standard of quality. Italian factories were so good, in fact, that many designs that were, shall we say, designed in Paris were actually made in Italy. The French would not be happy for me to talk about this, but it's true that if you look at the labels inside a lot of French ready-to-wear of the last 20 years, it will say made in Italy. So we're now in the factory, and we're at a moment in time when the Italians are starting to make things in multiples and to export them. And this is also a moment when Italy, as a design, center of design, starts to promote its goods through the Made in Italy label. And it's not just fashion, it's food, it's cinema, it's cars, it's product design. So a whole range of goods are starting to be promoted as Italian made and promoted very successfully. I'm going to walk you through a couple of the labels that you'll see. This is kind of the part of the show where you're going to start to see names that you recognize, the kind of greatest hits of Italian fashion. As I mentioned, a lot of those early 1950s labels, when the founder died or retired, they weren't taken up and carried forward. But from the 1970s onwards, we're going to start to see some really familiar faces. So Krizia was one of the early proponents of ready-to-wear. Also, someone like Gianni Versace. It's hard to overstate the influence of someone like Versace. And what I'm so delighted to share with you about what you're seeing on the screen is that this is a garment, this is an outfit that he personally donated to the V&A in 1985. And so you see an example of a design that he himself wanted to be remembered by. And he is using Italian-made materials. He's making this in a factory, but he's using fabrics that he has chosen himself. I interviewed him, sorry, I did not interview him. I wish I could have said I did that, but I interviewed the textile manufacturer who made the houndstooth wool that you see in this outfit. And he recalls that Versace actually came to the factory himself. The factory is in Prato. So he made an effort to get in a car, drive to Prato, see the samples, and choose one himself. So he was very intimately connected to the details of each of his collections, and he cared deeply about the materials, about the fabrics. The wool that you see here was manufactured there in Prato, according to Versace's instructions, and it was paired with a butter-soft leather that's been quilted in a kind of diamond pattern. So, and also, who can miss those enormous shoulders? We're definitely in the 80s. It was a great decade. I think it's underappreciated. And he also donated the whole kind of head-to-toe ensemble, including the accessories, the jewelry, the shoes, the hat. So it's a wonderful, typical ensemble. And it showcases Italian textiles, which still remain a kind of secret weapon for Italian designers. It's not that couture disappeared in the 1970s and 80s, there were still designers who were making delectable made-to-measure pieces like Gianfranco Ferre, who this evening coat is on display. We've borrowed it from a museum in Florence, from the museum in Palazzo Pitti. And it really is a tour de force of Italian craftsmanship. It was made in 1989, so even though ready-to-wear has now become the new fashion language, there still are designers who are creating really standout pieces. And when you get up close in the exhibition to this evening coat, you'll see that the surface embroidery actually comes out three-dimensionally from the surface of the garment. There's other protagonists as well, someone like Moschino with his Yellow Pages jacket, perhaps the only voice of whimsy and subversion in Italian fashion, because really, you know, Italy is so far from London and its London's punk history. They don't do subversion very well in Italy. It's all about kind of straight glamour. And of course, Versace's menswear also equally important. There's a lot to say about the alternatives that he gave men for dressing up and to be a bit of a peacock. We've also got some great knitwear, and knitwear is a segment of Italian fashion production that is particularly strong. Italians have long been adept at both machine knit and then computerized knitwear that allowed them to create really inventive patterns and prints. Missoni, very, very important for our story. There's quite a few examples of Missoni on display. Leather and fur. The House of Fendi is particularly at the forefront of innovative fur techniques, and we've been able to include this piece from their archive in Rome. So we're kind of rounding out to the end of the show chronologically. This is the portion of the exhibition that you'll encounter first, which I quite like here because it gives you a kind of taster and a kind of premonition of what's to come. We've called it the cult of the fashion designer, because it showcases individual designers who I would say in some cases have become more famous than the celebrity clients that they dress. It's not that the Italians are the only ones doing this, but I think that the Italians are particularly adept at creating their own celebrity around their labels. Also, they're no longer just designing fashion. They now design a whole universe of goods and products, from bedding to cutlery to the inside of yachts. They've expanded their remit to include a whole range of goods. One of my favorite pieces in the show, kind of curator top 10, top 5, is this design by Tom Ford for Gucci. And it's an example of a designer who not only turned around the fortunes of a kind of languishing fashion house or accessories house, but he himself became almost their best advertisement. A handsome gentleman from Texas who had a real style and panache. He infused new life into an ailing brand and made it something else. So this dress, modeled by Amber Valletta, photographed by Mario Testino, is also a great reminder of how innovative the Italian fashion houses have been in commissioning really game-changing photography and advertising imagery. We have to talk about Miuccia Prada, because she has been at the forefront of the recent wave of what's exciting about Made in Italy. She cares deeply about contemporary art, and her own taste and holiday destinations and her own wardrobe seem to be the source of endless commentary. So she's a fascinating figure in Italian fashion and has done things like take a kind of home-style technique like tie-dye and transformed it into a covetable designer fashion garment. We've also got fantastic accessories in the show. I haven't shown you many examples. They're there for you to discover. But the Fendi Baguette bag was perhaps one of the first so-called it bags in the fashion world. And this is just one example. It's collectible. It changes every year. So you can acquire a whole wardrobe of Fendi baguettes if you want. This one's a kind of fuzzy mohair example given by the House of Fendi to the V&A. But you could also have a very plain, sober black example. And by making these bags changeable every season, the designer very cleverly gave you a reason to go out and buy another one. And these fantastic boots by Dolce Gabbana. Dolce Gabbana have really connected with their Southern Italian heritage, and so their collections really celebrate that heritage. And there's a kind of Baroque, the British might call it vulgarity, I don't know. The British are very understated, so they might, but they have been very successful in harnessing that tradition. And there are other examples of accessories in the show. We've tried to put as many as there's space. I think what's important to remember about today's kind of fashion system is that for many people, the fashion it bag or the boot is one way of buying into a designer's look or collection each season without having to pay for the full outfit, and also to get a taste of that element of something new to add a life or lift to your existing wardrobe. So accessories are often a designer's leading category. Each collection depends on the bags, the shoes, and so on. We have some new names in the show, some new faces. It was really important to me in curating this project to not just focus on the obvious choices, but to try to identify designers who are up and coming, who are about to have a very influential career. And this is a designer named Fausto Puglisi, who's also from the South, but now based in Milan. And he did quite a brisk business for about 20 years designing stage clothes for celebrity singers. And I think you can tell from the catwalk image, and this is a garment that's in the show, that his eye for detail and kind of flash and dash has really translated well into garments for the catwalk. I think he's perhaps the predecessor, or rather the successor, of someone like Gianni Versace, who really worked well with leather. He used a lot of bold print. Puglisi is someone who celebrates Italian craftsmanship. Each of his collections derive all of the raw materials, all of the fabrics and the leather goods from Italian suppliers. His embroidery specialist, he tells me, is the one who used to do the work for Versace, but he wouldn't tell me who it was because it's a secret. and they do keep these secrets quite close to their hearts because this is their competitive advantage. But he described receiving a sample from one of the factories when he was planning a collection. He described it as like Christmas. Every time something new comes in for a collection and he wants to approve its quality, he opens the box and it's just like Christmas morning. So here's a designer who is just infused with passion for his craft, for his business, and has to work very hard indeed to break through the glass ceiling of Milan and the Italian fashion industry, because there's a tradition of celebrating the established names, and it's very hard for a young designer to break through. So that's why I'm so pleased to be able to showcase someone like Fausto. He told me when his press agent advised him that the V&A wanted to include a piece of his in the show, he told me that he cried. And so that's a difference that a museum exhibition can make to a young designer. That's also why I'm delighted that the Portland Art Museum has included a group of Portland-based designers, because they are people who should be celebrated for their daring and for their risk-taking in founding a business and really taking a chance, because it's not easy. So hooray for Portland. We do have some of the greatest hits also in this section, and what I think is particularly interesting about Italian fashion over the last couple of years, and you may not notice this when you go through the show, so I'll just point it out, is that designers like Giorgio Armani, who based their kind of bread and butter on ready-to-wear, have in recent years started couture lines. And so when the Oscars come up, you'll notice that Armani Privé, the Armani Couture line, has become a kind of go-to choice for a lot of actresses on the red carpet. I think that this trend has something to do with designers wanting to explore kind of fantasy dressing and kind of the ultimate in luxury that couture affords them, because they're using the best quality materials, they're designing for individual clients, they have that intimate relationship that you miss in the ready-to-wear system. So one example is Armani, also Dolce Gabbana. You'll recognize this wonderful advertising image from outside. This is a ready-to-wear piece, but Dolce Gabbana have also, a couple of years ago, started a couture line after decades of making ready-to-wear. So I think that's quite telling of where things are going. Valentino Couture, one of my top 5. I think I'm up to 5 now, so I probably should stop. I absolutely love this dress. I had the great privilege of going into the Valentino atelier in Rome to watch them sewing. And they build on decades of tradition that are handed down from one generation of seamstresses to the other. And they do everything by hand for the couture collection. All of the silk piping is made and rolled by hand and can take weeks to assemble. And they feel a lot of pride for each of the gowns that they produce. They still refer to their seamstresses, who are, I would say, average age about 70, as the girls, le ragazze. And you can see in this gown a wonderful collision of tradition and innovation. The tradition comes from the handcraft, the beautiful fabrics. The silk was printed in Como. And the innovation comes from this startling inclusion of creatures from the natural world down the center of the dress. Who but the House of Valentino would put a rhinoceros on the chest of a model and a sprig of coral at her feet? It's a wonderful, delightful gown. And we're so pleased that the House of Valentino donated it to the V&A so that we could include it in this exhibition. We end with a group of filmed interviews talking about Italian fashion's future. And this is about a 5-minute video loop, which if you have time, I would encourage you to linger and listen to the commentary. The people that I interviewed, and I'm the shadowy person behind the camera asking the questions, but they include from the top left, going clockwise, they include Mr. Rubinacci, the Neapolitan tailor, a Gucci leather goods technician from Florence, Mr. Jacopo Etro. Then we have Angela Massoni. In the center, the 2 new designers from Valentino, Pierpaolo Piccioli and Maria Grazia Chiuri, and then Franco Sozzani from Vogue Italia. And I asked them questions about the future of Italian fashion, and some of the answers are quite surprising. There's quite a bit of spicy commentary about the terrible government and high taxes, and the difficulties, frankly, of doing business in Italy, where it's impossible to have a kind of nimble employment market. And so I think for me, as a curator, thinking about putting on this exhibition, it wasn't enough to simply say Italian fashion is great. Certainly it is, and you'll see many, many examples of fantastic design, stylish design. But what was important also was to include a bit of the debate around the future of Made in Italy, to include some honest commentary about what it means when China is now the future of both production and consumption for a lot of fashion in the world, and how these designers, how these protagonists of the industry who are on the ground designing and making, how they're responding to those challenges. So this is where the kind of formal part of my talk ends, but I will be delighted to take your questions. And I think I just want to conclude by thanking the Portland Art Museum for having me. I'm deeply honored to be here, and also to thank you for giving up your Sunday afternoon to join us. Thank you very much. So I think thank you very much. I think what we're going to do is, if there are questions, I will take them from the audience, but we do have a couple of roving microphones, and because it's such a large crowd, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone so that everyone can benefit from your question before I answer it, that would be fantastic. So I see we've got some questions. Or I could also, yes, there's some roving microphones coming. Why don't we start here up at the front with the stripy top? Yeah.
At the beginning, you had talked about how challenging it was to bring the clothing to life. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was a beautiful show, by the way. And I thought it was a really interesting choice with some of the pieces where you included shoes and hats. Could you touch upon why those pieces kind of garnered those additional accessories and why the others did not?
That's a great question because it comes to the really heart of the nuts and bolts of fashion curation. And that has to do with mannequins. And mannequins are the most expensive element of putting on a fashion exhibition. Each one costs about $1,000. So you have to choose carefully, and you also have to choose something that can be consistent throughout the exhibition. And so I grappled with heads. That doesn't come out very well. I grappled with heads. I thought deeply about whether to have mannequins with heads. And I decided that because the exhibition covers such a long chronology, the heads of the 50s look and the kind of attendant, possibly hair and makeup and styling would be very different from those of later decades. And so throughout the exhibition, there are headless mannequins. So that meant no hats, and therefore also very little jewelry is possible. The shoes are slightly different. The mannequins that we chose, they have a spigot through the foot that holds them to the floor, and so you cannot put a shoe on that kind of a mannequin unless you drill a hole in the shoe, which is like sacrilege for me. But then we thought we could also possibly use a kind of anonymous ballet slipper, some kind of a prop. But I think in the end, we wanted to try to stay as authentic as possible to the full outfit that the designer originally intended. So that meant not a lot of shoes made it. Those that do have shoes are even more expensive mannequins that have a special neck brace that props it up rather than a spigot. So it's a very technical answer, but it gets to the heart of some of the first questions we ask ourselves when we're putting together a show. Thank you. Yes, other questions? Yes?
Can you speak a bit to the British perspective of Italian fashion?
Oh,
because
yes.
it's been very, you emphasized an American perspective.
Yes, I can speak to the British perspective because it challenged me to do this exhibition, particularly the early years of the show. Because the British, and I say this with love in my heart, because the British tend to be understated in their fashion choices from the 50s and 60s. They were very reluctant to embrace Italian fashion early on. The Americans were at the forefront of promoting Italian design. And so as a result, the V&A's collection is very light in Italian fashion from this period. So that meant that I had to borrow very heavily to tell the story of the Salah Bianca years from the post-war to about 1960, because we don't have anything. So everything from that part of the show is borrowed. So later on, when we get to the 70s and 80s, the British are buying with great enthusiasm. But those early years, they were quite slow to jump on board. Yes, great. Other questions? There's one in the front here.
Were there any problems when setting up the exhibition and installing it?
Any problems setting up the exhibition? Yes, I think that one of the challenges, too, was the fact that the Italians are quite territorial. And the Italian fashion designers they have big egos. So I actually had phone calls where I was told that I couldn't put certain designers next to each other. And in case you're wondering, don't ever put Marni next to Prada. That's a big no-no. So some of the egos, actually, that I had to deal with that was a little daunting, but we did get past it. Yes, there's a question here.
You didn't mention Schiaparelli, and I wondered if there was a big break in World War II, if there was any continuity between before the war and after the war, or in Italian fashion, or did some people just sort of end, or?
Yes, so Schiaparelli, I'm glad you asked that because she was an Italian designer, incredibly important and influential. She, however, her career played out in Paris. So even though she was Italian-born, I consider her to be a French designer. She made use of the amazing network of craftspeople in Paris, and her atelier was based in Paris. Also, even though she had a long career that spanned, she retired in the 1950s, but her point of influence was really the 1930s. I think that some of her collaborations with the Surrealists stand as some of the greatest achievements in fashion history, and we have a number of her designs in the V&A's permanent collection. But the story that I wanted to tell unfolded in the post-war period when I think that she was less influential. But mainly it was because of her location, her geography, and where her career unfolded. And then in terms of the break of the war, it's absolutely, I certainly don't want to give the impression that Italian fashion did not exist before the Second World War. Some of the houses existed pre-war that we feature in the show, and a number of them were founded right after, but what was different with the war's end was that for the first time, people from outside Italy started to notice and buy. And so that, in a way, is a nice device chronologically to begin with the war's end, because it talks about the distribution of Italian fashion outside of Italy for the first time. So it wasn't covered by British Vogue, American Vogue before the war. Some of the very first mentions of Italian fashion come after the war's end. Yes, a question here.
I've enjoyed your comments very much, and I'm curious about your perspective, if you could share more about the French reaction and the French toward the Italians.
Yes. Well, that is a good question, because there's some great anecdotes. You know, in the Giorgini archive, I came across some press clippings that were really priceless, because the fashion press really egged on a rivalry between Paris and Italy. They loved this idea that an Italian upstart, these new designers were going to topple Paris from the top of the pyramid. And so the French were at first dismissive and then jealous. So there's a great quote from Pierre Balmain, who was interviewed about this invasion, and Balmain said, "Let the American buyers go and play with baby bonnets in Italy. They'll come to Paris for their real fashions." So there was definitely a rivalry, but the press certainly egged it all on. Yeah. There's some questions in the back. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. I was wondering how you made the choice who to include and who to exclude, because I know you were concentrating on couturier, but there are houses like Max Mara and a number of others that I did not see represented. So I wondered, what was your criteria?
Well, certainly Max Mara is incredibly important, and we've only been able to, mainly for reasons of space, to include one of their prototypical camel hair coats in the show. And so this gets a great question, because it gets again to the heart of curatorial work about choosing. And I think for me, I tried to focus on not just the greatest hits, but examples of design that were moving things forward. So, I wanted to include other examples of Max Mara from today, for example, but really their moment of influence that changed the way that people dressed was the camel cashmere coat that they made affordable for the first time. And so, I could have done that also with Missoni. Missoni almost crosses the entire period of this exhibition. They were started in 1960, but really their moment of influence came in the 70s and 80s. So we have examples more recent of Missoni in the V&A, but I wanted to save the contemporary area for perhaps some of those younger designers who haven't yet reached the super high level of fame. And so it's a bit of a balancing act. And certainly personal taste has to come into it, but I tried through consultation with Italian scholars and through Italian fashion commentators and press to get a really balanced view of old and new, historic and contemporary, couture and ready-to-wear. And so I certainly am open to, I very well know that there are a lot of people missing. And so please shout out if you have favorites that aren't there. But there's certainly a lot more in the exhibition than I showed on screen today. Any other questions?
Hi, Sonnet.
Yes.
I have a question. I love the Pucci, the lilac cocktail dress that's from '57, and I was really surprised to see that it was also that they were also designing in 1987 for the red and green dress on runway. Could you tell us a little bit about the House of Capucci and what happened to them?
Yes, so Roberto Capucci was the darling of the early years of the Salah Bianca. He, I think 52 was his first show when he was 19, maybe 20 at the most. And so he got all of this fashion press for being the wonder boy. And that was really, fame is hard. I think he struggled thereafter with, trying to grapple with how to balance his desire for creativity with running a business. But one of the things that that I guess was a thread, so to speak, throughout all of his collections was a kind of sculptural quality. So both that lilac dress that you first encounter in the Salah Bianca area and that extravagant fuchsia and green, they both have a kind of swirling cocoon-like feature that was very present in his work across many decades. But he retired from fashion in the late 80s and became more of an artist, really. And so even though he's still alive, he's no longer active in fashion, but he has a wonderful foundation in Florence, which is right next to the Boboli Gardens and Palazzo Pitti, where you can see more examples of his work. And if you're going to Florence, it has the best view of the Duomo from their gardens. I highly recommend you going. I think that might be all the questions. We might have time for one more, perhaps? Yeah.
I'm curious about whether your own wardrobe choices have changed as a result of being involved in this exhibit.
Oh, that's such a hard question. I try to participate, but frankly, curatorial work is very dusty and dirty. So I'm most likely, crawling on the floor to adjust a hemline rather than, swanning around in designer clothes. So I have to say, I did have to buy a few key pieces for the various opening parties and things, but for the most part, I'm the one in the little black dress in the background. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sonnet. It's such an honor to partner with you. You're really a fabulous curator, so thank you so much, Sonnet. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.